Hi, everybody. This is our update for March 25, episode 332 of DAT's IQ Weekly Market Update. I'm Dean Croak, market analyst at DAT, coming to you live from the Mid-America Truck Show in Louisville, Kentucky, where we've got a booth. We'll be catching up with a lot of you later this week. Also with co-host Chad Kennedy and special guest again today, David Hoffman. Good to have you back, David.
Hey, Dean. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. What's been news in your world since we last spoke?
Just doing some consulting work, and the talk of the town right now is just how's everyone going to handle these tariffs that are potentially coming to us April 2nd.
Yeah, I thought it'd be good to have a discussion with you today about what the tariffs mean, especially from a shipper perspective, how shippers might be thinking about this given all of the uncertainty.
Yeah, I think a lot of shippers are just trying to, kind of craft some projections to figure out, where are our suppliers? Could we shift suppliers? How's this going to affect our capacity? It's a lot of modeling, I would say, right now. And I know one of the one of the projects I worked on in the fall, a construction supply distributor, they went ahead and brought in additional inventory. So they saw a lot of rebar. So they just said, you know what, we're going to bring in additional inventory. We know it's going to drive our carrying costs, but we want to be able to serve our customers. So I think each business is just going to depend on what their strategies and how they want to play it out. It's a double-edged sword. It's almost like you're darned if you do, you're darned if you don't.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll bring you back in a little bit later. We'll talk more about that in great depth. Chad, you've just come back from India. How was that trip?
Yeah, it was a great trip. We've got a great team down there. It was really nice to meet them face to face and do some work with them. So it's good to be back in the U.S. too.
Yeah, good to have you back. Yeah. All right. Okay, so let's dive into some of the key trends we're watching this week for our market update. Flatbed rates are the real star here. Reefer and dry van mostly flat. Load posts were down. But in flatbed, we're seeing some super seasonal activity. Best start to a year since 2017 in the flatbed spot market. In 2017, year-to-date spot rates were up 13%. This year, they're up 8% and closing in on 2023 levels. And they're just 10 cents a mile off 2018. So it'd be really good if that market kept going on a similar trajectory, especially for some flatbed carriers that are struggling at the moment. Other data, ATA truckload tonnage index experienced a 3% sequential tonnage increase last month. That's the second straight year-over-year gain. That represents the contract freight market primarily. New rate development, Chad's going to be talking about this in depth. Some interesting trends there. Replacement rates entering routing guides continue to trend upwards. By my count, they've been heading upwards, albeit slowly, for almost a year now. A couple of anniversaries this week, in fact 3 if you count the 5-year anniversary of the World Health Organization declaring a pandemic. Baltimore Key Bridge 1-year anniversary is up this week, and of course the Suez Canal Ever Given blockage was 4 years ago. Hard to believe that much time has passed. The Suez Canal was blocked for 6 days, as you'll all remember, when that container ship ran aground. The Baltimore Bridge is expected to be completed in 2028 at a cost of just over $1.7 billion. We'll be covering that in this week's market update that'll be out this evening, having a look at the 1-year anniversary and how imports are looking. Also talking about the winter salad bowl transition to Salinas, California from Yuma, Arizona, and the latest residential construction numbers for housing. Let's have a look at our load to truck ratio this week. In dry van, load posts a decrease for the 4th week, almost identical to last year's volume for week 12. Load to truck ratio is down slightly to 4.50. In the refrigerated market, volumes decreased for the 4th week also, down 3% last week. Load to truck ratio ended the week just under 7 at 6.92 loads per truck. And in flatbed, volumes increased for the 9th week, following last week's 3% gain. Volumes are about 30% higher than last year, and now 2% higher than they were in 2017. And you'll recall that was a recovery year following the 2016 freight recession. Last week's flatbed load to truck ratio ended at 46.92. Having a look at our year-over-year look at spot rates, rates decreased a penny per mile last week. The national 7-day rolling average paid carriers an average of $1.63. Loads moved were about 3% higher last week. At $1.63, line haul rates are 6 cents a mile higher than last year and 6 cents a mile higher than where they were in 2019. On our top 50 lanes, ranked by the volume of loads moved, carriers were paid an average of $1.91. That's 28 cents a mile higher than the 7-day rolling average. And in our Midwest region bellwether states, which have the highest correlation to the national average, outbound spot rates decreased 3 cents a mile on a 5% higher volume of loads. Carriers were paid an average of $1.87 in the Midwest. That's 24 cents a mile higher than the national average. In the refrigerated market, line haul rates were flat last week, paying carriers an average of $1.89 on a 2% higher volume of loads moved. After being higher than last year since the end of January, Reefer spot rates are identical to last year and about 3 cents a mile higher than in 2019. In flatbed, we're off to our best start, as we covered a little bit earlier. The national 7-day rolling average is up about 8% year to date. That's pretty extraordinary. They were up 4 cents a mile last week. That's the largest weekly gain we've seen this year. Carriers were paid an average of $2.09 per mile, up for the 6th week and 14 cents a mile higher than last year. Also 10 cents a mile higher than where we were in 2019, but 10 cents a mile lower than where we were in 2018. So it's kind of straddling 2018, 2019, which were two very different freight markets. Let's have a look at our short-term forecasts. Let's start with dry van. Remember, these are our Ratecast forecast out 35 days for loads moving over 550 miles, excluding fuel. So they tend to weight more long-term seasonal averages. In dry van, Ratecast is expecting a little bit of a deterioration in the forecast this week. It's expecting rates down 14 cents to $1.48. Being under $1.50 a mile is somewhat concerning. Last year at 426, the 26th of April, it was $1.53 a mile. So Ratecast is expecting by the end of April, we're about 7 cents a mile lower than where we were last year. In the refrigerated market, Ratecast is expecting rates to drop another 18 cents a mile to $1.70. 426 last year, rates were $1.83. So rates were 13 cents a mile higher last year than where Ratecast thinks rates will bottom out this year. I do expect, though, if we're seeing some produce volumes move into the market by mid-April, we should see that start to bottom out. But when we get into middle April, that is typically when we see refrigerated rates start to bottom out, but that downward trend is somewhat concerning. A lot of model agreement there for the three scenarios. And flatbed, Ratecast is expecting rates to be flat out to 26th of April, flat at about $2.13. And in last year, rates were about $1.98. So the difference this year is that Ratecast is expecting rates to be about 15 cents a mile higher than where they were last year by the time we get out to the 26th of April. So some better year-over-year comps in flatbed. Of course, that's going to be heading towards the peak in that market as we get into May and June, but we're certainly seeing some very strong super seasonal activity as we head into April. Over to you, Chad, for the contract market forecast.
Yep. Thanks, Dean. So everything Dean just covered was from a broker to carrier perspective. So my trends can look a little bit different. This is all from a shipper to broker or carrier perspective. So the first trend line we have at the top is spot premium ratio. This goes back to 2016. This is the premium that spot rates demand over or below contract rates. You can see right now we're at a negative 12.4%, quite low. So that's a function of spot rates dropping a little bit from week to week, and also contract rates going up a little bit, expanding that spread there. This is the lowest spot premium ratio that we've seen since May of 2024. So almost a year low point there. The new rate differential in blue there in the middle, also going back to 2016. This measures the percentage difference between new contract rates and those contract rates that they replaced. We're at positive 3.4%. So what we're seeing here is short-term market, that spot market softening a little bit, long-term contract rates with a little bit of upwards pressure. So two different stories there. The contract rate index there at the very bottom, that's really hasn't had enough pressure on it to really make a significant move upwards yet, up and to the right. But we expect that to come hopefully sometime in the back half of this year. I did want to also mention on the new rate differential there, that's the highest that we've had since May 2022. So high point in almost a year there as well. Then on to temp control, very similar story. We've got a spot premium ratio at 9.2% negative, and new rate differential still hanging out in the positives at 1.7%. Contract rate index not quite making a move up and to the right yet. And then finally, we've got all three: dry van, temp control, and flatbed rate per mile. So you can just see the inputs to the metrics that I just showed you there and the relationship between the two. That's a wrap on contract rates, Dean.
Thank you, Chad. All right, let's dive into our topic this week, which is a little bit around tariff uncertainty, as much as we can ascertain where tariffs are. David, what sort of trends are you seeing in the world of supply chains as shippers grapple with all of the uncertainty surrounding tariffs?
So the last I've read and understand as far as the tariffs that's coming April 2nd is it's 25% on Canada goods imported, 25% on Mexico goods imported, and an additional 10% on any goods coming in from China. I think, for a lot of companies, especially shippers, right, they're trying to figure out, and they faced this, if you think about it, back when the pandemic happened and then the economy started to open up. What's the inventory strategy going to look like? Is it going to be just in time, where you're not, carrying additional raw materials and extra safety stock of finished goods? Or are you going to do the just in case model, where you're going to increase your raw materials, you're going to increase your safety stock items on your top selling items to have that those goods in demand when it comes down the sales pipeline? So I think that's the biggest question that shippers are facing. I would even say, based on some of the data sets that I've looked at, Dean, and I know you guys have mentioned this, and I just made some notes here. So if you look at the ISM index, it's up 5% year over year, but it's down from January if you look at February's numbers. Housing starts from census.gov is down 2.9%. So you talked about the flatbed market, you're seeing some increase. I wonder if some of that is attributed to the administration wants to have allow more domestic drilling. Also, could it be they're trying to get some those steel and aluminum products into the U.S. before the tariffs come live? Yep. But oil rig count, interesting enough, on Baker Hughes is down 5% year over year. We talked about produce volumes. That's down 16% from the United States Department of Agriculture. But it's March. It's still kind of cold. I think, like you said, there's still some time to see those produce volumes ramp up. So we're still early in that. Cass index was down 5.5% year over year. And then the only good news is, I would say, for some of these carriers, is diesel's down about 12% year over year. So it's just a lot of the indicators that you're looking at and seeing from a shipper perspective, it's not flashing the green lights. I think, again, it comes back to they're just really trying to figure out what do they need to do to make sure they can meet customer demand.
David, you mentioned the pandemic and how this compares to that. So we had the pandemic, and then just last fall, we had the port strikes, the threats of port strikes, and preparing for that, pulling inventory ahead. I've talked to some shippers that have said they're starting to pull some inventory ahead, or have over the last month. Do you get a sense that we're better than we used to be at this since our learnings from the pandemic and the port strikes? Are we getting more agile in the supply chain?
I don't believe so. And the reason I say that is I think for a lot of these shippers, right, when you look at their supplier base, right, so some of them might put all their eggs in one basket because they want to get discounted prices. Some shippers, they might want to diversify across multiple suppliers. But again, we're so connected as a world, right, on these other countries, and for them to behave, again, I'm not going down that political rabbit hole, but if you think about it, right, when Russia invaded Ukraine, you saw oil spike. So all of a sudden now you're having these fuel surcharges. So companies are trying to figure out how do we pass these costs on. I feel as though, you still have some companies, in terms of being prepared for these disruptions, Chad. I come back to lead time, and lead time is a habit that's based on their customers. So downstream in their supply chain, how are their customers behaving? Are they respecting the lead time? Because if they're not, you'll see transportation prices go up. You'll see capacity constraints. You'll see suppliers not be able to give as much material because they have other commitments. So I think it's going to be almost just kind of, the wild, wild west if things open up and get crazy, where everyone's just kind of scrambling, versus having these plans in place, really thinking about long-term, what's going to happen? How can I prepare for this? Because I feel like since the pandemic, Chad, it's been disruption after disruption after disruption, and just trying to get a sense of normalcy has been a real challenge.
Yeah. You mentioned lead time. For our audience, they probably think about tender lead time, but you're talking about order lead time, right? Which stretches out even further back.
So I'm talking about both.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I've seen examples where, shippers will have relationship with suppliers, and suppliers will give them certain lead time. Well, some of those shippers don't respect the lead time because, again, their customers downstream aren't giving them the proper lead time.
Sure.
But the one metric I did spend a lot of time studying on the shipper side, I still do, is the lead times of transportation. So what's the time frame between you give that tender to a carrier versus when they have to pick up the freight? And I've seen in my career, you can pay a couple $100 more, you can pay a couple $1,000 more, depending how tight the market is. So really, it depends on, is that shipper trying to respect the lead time, or do they have mechanisms in place where if their customers are giving short lead time, they're then passing those costs on to the customer? When I was on the transportation side, Chad, it was not uncommon where, shippers would come to you last minute, same day, I have a load I need to get out. Their rate's $1,200, contract rate, but hey, you're going to close at 3:30. You're going to pay $3,000 to get that freight out your door.
Right. Reminds me of the academic concept of the bullwhip effect, kind of that butterfly effect, right? You have that small change at the retailer location, maybe a promotion or whatever, and it has increasing degrees of change down through the supply chain. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great example where you saw that when the pandemic kind of started to open up the bullwhip effect.
Right.
I think there's still some potential now where if you look on the ISM report, they said you're seeing a lot of these companies' inventories are shrinking. Well, if maybe these tariffs aren't what they're supposed to be and businesses have a little more certainty and can kind of figure out what to do, maybe they'll start to order more. Now these manufacturers start to output more, and that'll kind of be maybe not as a violent bullwhip effect, but maybe a smaller one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
I was just looking at some data on out of Houston, David. You're talking about drill pipe. I think what we're starting to see in the spot market, particularly flatbed, is the attrition of carriers, because it's a smaller segment, very specialized segment of the market with open deck flatbed transport. So because we're coming out of winter, right? So it's a particularly hard time. I do think you see carriers shift out of that market, but some of the volumes are very interesting. One of our busiest lanes in fact, our biggest flatbed market is Texas, and our biggest 5-digit zip area is the Houston market.
Houston to Lubbock, yeah.
Yeah, and Lubbock is like a very big freight lane. It's by far bigger than El Paso, Dallas, Fort Worth, New Orleans out of Houston. If I draw a line from, say, when the pandemic started, volumes have been trending up over that arc of time, and there's some weekly fluctuations, but year over year volumes on that Houston Lubbock lane are down 20%. Rates are up 12% though. So what we're starting to see is rates up both year over year, monthly and weekly, up by fairly significant numbers, which tells me capacity is tightening even though volumes are dropping. So some of our leading macroeconomic indicators may not be directionally indicative of where the rates are going. I think what we're seeing is supply readjusting itself down to where demand is, particularly in the spot market. And I notice on the NRD, or the new rate development on Chad's side of the ledger, it looks like contract capacity is still plentiful. Because I think, Chad, if you look at your numbers, aren't the new rate development for flatbed still trending downwards? Or
flatbed is, yeah, that's right. Yeah, new rate differentials going down a little bit. Yeah.
So it kind of tells me that large contract carriers have more capacity, and those rates are still trending down. And I think that's probably a function of large contract loads that are more repetitive types of freight, like maybe dimension framing lumber, but certainly things like roofing shingles that move from big factories to big warehouses. I think our market, though, in the flatbed market, is more specialized, one-off project type work, a lot of lead time, a lot of accessorials, a lot of time under crane, and a lot of deadhead miles. So it's a little bit different. We see about 30% of our loads in flatbed move on spot. So it tells me that capacity is a little bit tighter in the spot market than it is in the contract market. So your shippers may be seeing a little bit different market, but certainly if they went to the spot market, I think they'd be finding some pretty steep rates at the moment.
Yeah, I think really it all depends on what the project is, like you said. I think, flatbed, just knowing what I know they haul, right? You think about the lumber again, and that's another big item that comes in from Canada. So could that be another item that they're trying to get across the border before these tariffs are hit? Again, not having specific data in front of me, but those are just some of the things that I think for that mode, for that specific asset type, you're going to see. And then again, I think I mentioned earlier what Trump has said, that they want to do more drilling domestically. So again, I can kind of see where there's going to be some more demand. Again, to your point, it could be a specialized project. So maybe they're going to play more on the spot versus a consistent contracted rate with a significant volume or consistent volume.
Yeah. Our carriers that we talk to on the cross-border side, they've had some of their busiest January, February years ever out of Toronto. And of course, Toronto is home to some very big steel manufacturing, steel and aluminum. So we do know that a lot of volume was moving ahead of the tariffs on the April the 4th. But they're still continuing to move. I think there's a lot of stockpiling going on there. Even though the rates have come back down, the volumes have been significant cross-border.
Yeah. And I think, I think Ken Adamo had posted a chart maybe a week or two ago where all of a sudden, like when the tariffs were coming, right, the volumes kind of stopped, where you're not seeing as much of that cross border. And I think a couple interesting things I've seen, from carriers and shippers, how they're handling it. So Estes, I think one of the LTL carriers had said before the tariffs were coming at the border, they were seeing delays at the border. So they couldn't tell, was this really an issue where all of a sudden there was all this activity and the brokers couldn't keep up? Or was it also a result of these countries, and I'm quoting the article, maybe trying to stick it to the US, where it's saying, hey, we're going to make you wait at the border a little bit. I also think I saw an interesting article, Dean, where now you're hearing about the Trump administration wants to possibly put shipping fees on any ships coming from China. So what this company did was they brought some product into the port of Tampa and had two other stops. I think one was in Mobile, Alabama, the other was in Houston. And they did an analysis of what if and said, is it cheaper just drop everything in Tampa, flatbed all the product to where we need to get it versus paying the tariffs? And it was cheaper to have it dropped in Tampa and then ship it to where it needed to go. So I think you're going to see a lot of companies just, I don't want to say flying by the seat of their pants, because that's not how they're trying to operate, but it's almost like they're being forced to do that based on what's going on. And I think you might start to possibly see capacity pulled in certain areas where maybe it's plentiful here, but now it needs to go over here because for whatever reason, they're trying to avoid these fees or these tariffs or whatever it is. It's just, I think we're in for a bumpy ride.
David, all these types of changes require RFPs for freight, right? Are you seeing a lot of RFP activity picking up with shippers?
I think this is the time of year, right, where you're going to do your RFPs. I often felt sometimes I was the minority with that. Like, I would not try and play the game of I wanted the cheapest rate. If the market went down 3%, I wouldn't go back to a carrier and say, reduce your rate. Conversely, if the market goes up 3%, I would expect them to hold it. Really, I think what you want to do is look at your network, figure out what lanes you have the most consistent volume in, try and contract those lanes. The lanes that are small, they're one-off and onesies and twosies, you're probably better off going on the spot market, because a lot of these, contract carriers, they have a lot of assets. They might want 6 to 10 to 20 loads a week. Whereas, if you only have that load every couple weeks, every couple months, and you're giving proper lead time, maybe you'll get a guy in the spot where you could get a competitive rate. So I think the RFP, that's really important. The other thing I would say too, Chad, is when you're implementing these RFPs, I think it's very important that you share your shipping locations and destinations names, because a lot of these carriers, they're smart. They know who the quality shippers are. They know who the poor consignees are. I'm not going to mention names, but we've had situations where I learned many years ago, we did an RFP. A few carriers came back and said, I don't want to pick up from this shipper. I don't want to pick up from this receiver. So we started doing NDAs, giving them all the information they need so they can make those decisions so there's no surprises. So I think it's very important to be transparent. I think it's very important that you try to give the carriers as much information as you can. But I would also say, like, even right now, looking out, Chad, I really think the RFP season, you're going to be flat to slightly up at best. I think you're still going to have solid route guide compliance. Again, unless all of a sudden things open up and there's more certainty in the business environment, I think 2025 might be a lot like 2024, where it's just steady as it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting advice, the transparency. We asked Kevin Zweier a couple of weeks ago from Argonne, a similar question: what's your top advice for shippers? And it was transparency, making sure that you're communicating those wait times and location details very clearly. Are you seeing? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think the more, even like some of the accessorial charges at the receivers that they're getting, hey, there's a lumper here, or, traditionally, here's the time it takes for a carrier to get empty, so they can kind of have an idea. Because again, I'd rather have a carrier know this going in than a carrier say, get this off my truck. I don't want to be here. I want to transload it. I mean, it causes more headaches than it needs to be. But I would also say too, Chad, I think you have some receivers that have just notoriously been known for causing problems and just not being a shipper or a receiver of choice. And I don't think anything's going to change anytime soon with them, because there's always a carrier that's going to pick up that freight because they need to get back to their head haul or they want to get to a certain area. I would love to see some of their processes change. I'm not going to change it, but I think it would make it a lot easier. I can tell you that this was several months ago. I watched a video of Kevin Knight, founder of Knight Swift, where he basically said, if we could get so much better at unloading trucks at the ports and at these DCs, we would find so much more capacity, available trucks, and we would save so much time. But, again, it's just, it's something that you need a larger group, a larger voice to really kind of bring it to light.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that shippers haven't felt that pain of the constraint of capacity in over 2 years. So you probably have a lot of people in positions where they've not felt the pain of a tight market. So it'll be a learning season if and when it does tighten up. Well, it will, but it's when.
I think if you can put certain metrics in place where you're showing shippers, hey, your warehouse is taking 4 hours to load a truck.
Yeah.
Carriers get 2 hours free. It's costing you, let's just say carrier charges $50 attention. So you're paying an extra $100 that's eating into your profit for that customer. How can you get better? Can you implement a yard management system? What are the sorts of things you can do to make your warehouse more efficient? So those are some of the things I think really need to still be addressed in the industry.
Yeah.
We did some projects when I was at Freightwaves. We geofenced dock doors. So not only did we geofence dwell time or detention time within a geofence of a shipper, we measured the amount of wait time trucks have outside the gate. Right, because a lot of in-gate time is misleading because you can actually be there in a long line for hours. Yes. Then we looked at the dwell time within the geofence, and then we looked at each dock door of a large warehouse. And what we found was there was a lot of variance across dock doors. And it gave you insight into how product flowed behind the door as it relates to forklift movement. It was, ELD data is very, very powerful. I don't know that carriers do that exceptionally well. But to Kevin's point, Kevin's a very good operator. I worked at Qualcomm for many years, and he was one of our big customers. We studied the amount of roll time that trucks have on line 3 of their ELD, which is on-duty driving. And the average for long-distance carriers was only 6.7 hours out of every day. So they got 11. So they're leaving quite a few hours on the table every day in terms of potential roll time. The reason is that they've got a 14-hour window from when they started work. So if you drive 7, then you've got to stop at 14. Now, if you spend 5 hours on a loading dock, you can see how you lose a lot of productivity. That's where it becomes a big issue because for some reason truckload carriers gave shippers the first hour and a half free to unload a trailer. Which turns into a lot more time once they actually get started. So I think there's a lot to be said for what Kevin spoke about. It's something we've been talking about to the industry for years. I know the Federal Motor Carrier is extracting a lot of ELD data from carriers anonymously to try and figure out how big of a problem this is because it has a direct bearing on accidents. When we were at Omnitrax, we studied freeform text analytics between the truck and dispatch. And we looked at accidents that happened after a truck left the loading dock. And one word came up continuously. In fact, about 35% of cases where there was an accident after an hour and a half or more wait time. And it was the word waiting. So when you look at text analytics, when the driver was typing in, I'm waiting to get loaded, I'm waiting, what you saw is this frustration. And when you pay drivers by the mile, they rush to their next appointment or they rush to make a delivery, and you see these rapid decelerations and accidents. So it's a huge problem that the Federal Motor Carrier is trying to deal with by looking at telematics data. Problem is, when you've got loose capacity like this, there's no real need to change because I guess you and Chad would know that the people on the loading dock are not the same people in procurement, right? When it comes to the cost of this.
Yeah. But I also think, Dean, companies should really evaluate their warehouse process and understand things. So, one of the things I learned is you could do a product segmentation. You can break them into A, B, and C. So your A products are as close to the dock door as possible. Your B items are in the middle of the warehouse, and your C items you kind of push in the back because you're not pulling them out as much. So again, you're trying to be as quick as you can, obviously, making sure you have proper safety protocols in place, but loading those trucks. In a perfect world, if you could do drop and hook where a driver doesn't have to sit there, there are some shippers that they don't do that. They can't do that for whatever reason. But I can tell you at my last job, when I implemented the yard management system, we would try and push the warehouse people to say, hey, when that truck arrives, mark it arrived, mark it loading. So that way it's almost like green, red, blue light. We had all these different colors where you give customer service real time. They could give the customer true updates. I like the idea with the ELDs, Dean, where I know some of these carriers, they have EDIs, but you can really get a sense where the more data that you can push to your customer, even an advanced shipment notification where that's on its way. But hey, it was held up for 2.5 hours because we were short warehouse personnel. So it took us a little bit longer to load. So that way you kind of a realistic expectation. Because a lot of these carriers too, Dean, they're trying to get to their destination on time. the publicly traded trucking companies are smart. Like when you go through the RFPs, and I've seen instances where shippers will try and find them if they're late, they're not going to sign that contract because there's variables that are outside of their control that they can't control. Weather, they can't control accidents. If a warehouse is slow, they're not going to sign that. So I think they've kind of gotten smarter. They have legal representation where the smaller carriers they'll sign those contracts because they need the freight. So it really just depends on those variables, but at the same time, I really do think companies can get much better looking at their warehouse processes as well to help their carrier base.
Yeah. It's one of those things that'll solve, well, it won't solve it completely, but it'll reduce driver turnover. It's one of the more frustrating things is sitting around waiting to get loaded or unloaded. It kind of brings us up to the end of our show. David, if people want to talk to you, engage your services, how do they get in contact with you?
Yeah, so there's 3 ways. You can go to my YouTube channel, Supply Chain and Logistics Hub. You can email me, david@hoffmansupplychainadvisors.com, or just go to my website, www.hoffmansupplychainadvisors.com.
Great. Thank you. Well, it's good to have you on. Really appreciate it. A couple of shout outs this week. Freightvine podcast, Chris Kaplan is talking to Mike Roth from the North American Council for Freight Efficiency, talking about how the industry is transitioning to things like future technology, zero emission batteries. Next week's show, owner-operator Corey Larson is back with us. International Road Check is 13th to 15th of May. Don't forget, we'll be at Mid-America Truck Show this week, booth 37415 in the South Wing. I'll be out front in the very first row opposite the South Wing with my truck. Call by and say hello. We'll also be speaking at the opening breakfast this week for the truck show, and then co-hosting Radio Nemo with Jimmy Mack on Road Dog Sirius XM 146 Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Make sure you set up alerts for our live show and subscribe to our channel. With that, another show's in the books. Thank you for watching. Be safe. Be nice to everyone. We'll see you back here at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific next week.